Female voice, male voice, lolly voice, monster voice.
Ang Programming Station Pinang Balita at Iba't ay tumatalakay sa may isukang kasalukuyan at napapanahon. Mapapolitika, mapapinyon, mapakomentaryo at balita, ang programa ito'y patas sa lahat. Walang kinikilingan, walang kinakampihan, at walang pinapanigaran ang programa ito. Ang programa ito ay public public service sa kahanginan at trabaho lamang.
Okay, ang time check natin sa umagang ito. Okay, anong oras na? Silipin natin, no? Okay, hindi makita. Okay, hindi po makita, no? Pagkakuha lang sa namin. 39 minutos, pasado po alas 10. Okay, ang kalendaryo natin na 8 Mayo po, 24, no? Okay, araw ng Miyerkules, araw ito mga shout out na lang sa lahat, no? Okay. Araw ng Miyerkules araw ito. Okay, medyo late ang kuhan natin pero wala problema. Okay, basta tuloy lang ang balita natin. Okay. So, pasok tayo sa programa Consolidated News natin. Okay, sa umagang ito. Dito po sa programa Halo-Halo Special, Opinion, Balita at iba pa. Okay, kasama ko sa konti ng mamamayan at sa kautayan sa mamamayan. No? Okay, magandang umaga. Good morning sa inyo lahat. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Okay. Sabi po ni ex-spokesman Atty. Harry Roque, okay, yung ex-PDEA agent ay wala daw criminal conviction, no? Puro kaso lang. Okay, puro kaso lang mga suki, no? Eh, siyempre sa trabaho ganyan, hindi maiwasan mo daming kaso isampa sa'yo, no? Okay, puro mayayaman ang kalaban mo mga suki, no? Okay, so walang conviction, sabi po ni Atty. Harry Roque. Maraming kaso pero nalagpasan niya itong si Jonathan Morales. Pero huwag muna tayo pupunta dyan. Nagtawan natin mga suki, mga kababayan. Okay, itong mag-aaral natin po sa
Station doon, balita at ay tumatala sa mag-aaral sa lakihan at napakamuman. Politika, mapagpinon, mapakomentaryo at balita, ang programa ito'y patas sa lahat. Walang kinikilingan, walang kinakampihan, at walang pinapanigan ang programa ito. Ang programa ito ay public service sa kahanginan at trabaho lamang.
Female voice, male voice, Wally voice, monster voice.
Okay, hindi ko pinipilit ang boses ko ay baka mawala na. Okay, makinig lang tayo ilang araw na, no? Hindi ko pinipilit po ang boses ko na baka hindi na ako maka-broadcast pag pipilitin ko mga suki, no? Okay, pero mag-aral pa rin tayo sa geopolitics mga suki, no? Yung mga nakaraan na dyan sa Middle East, ito po ang pinag-aralan natin mga suki, mga kababayan. So pamagitan po ng isang academe, si Professor Said Muhammad Marandi, no? Iran finds its place in the multipolar society ba ito? Okay, pakinggan natin na si Professor Said Marandi. Okay, Muhammad Marandi, yung mga nangyari po sa mga ISIS, Al-Qaeda, okay, kung ano-ano po dyan sa Middle East mga suki, no? Kung ano pinagmulan itong mga okay, nakadisturbo sa kapayapaan, kung sino po mga magpondo, makinig tayo. Parehas tayo makinig, no? So, aral ito education, okay, yung hindi pa makaabot ng mga mga kaguluhan po sa daigdig mga suki. No? So parehas tayo mag-aral. Ako mag-aral din. Okay, courtesy po ni Professor Said Muhammad Marandi, no? Okay. Academe. Sa kanyang research mga suki, no? Ayan. Okay. Antayin natin.
We've really gotten to see Iran become a major player on the world stage in the last couple of years, working and making partnerships in various regions. So before we get to the obvious discussions about Gaza, I'd like to take a closer look at some of the other areas Iran is working in. So in 2021, President Raisi said that Latin America had become a priority for Iran, in which to expand its influence and sphere of action. And he traveled there in June of last year. Iran has up to the socialist regimes of Venezuela, Nicaragua, Bolivia, and Cuba, and providing them with weapons and military support. What exactly is Iran doing in Latin and South America, and what partnerships should we look for this year?
I think it's important to keep in mind that there has been a lot of overlap between Iran
Professor Said Muhammad Marandi,
revolutionary movements in Latin America, in the sense that they were anti-imperialist, and also most political parties and factions in Iran are left-leaning. So social justice issues in Iran are also important. And the revolution in Nicaragua and the revolution in Iran happened almost simultaneously. So after the revolution, Iran began to establish close ties with Cuba, with Nicaragua, and later on, after President Chavez came to power, with Venezuela as well. But also it has very good relations with a host of different countries, like Brazil. Right now, the president has had a historically good relationship with Iran. In general, Iran's policy has always been to strengthen ties with countries in the global south, and Latin America is very much a part of that. Ever since the United States began to increase pressure on Venezuela, the Iranians began to get more involved there, and they helped them restore their electricity as well as their petrochemical plants and refineries. And in other areas as well. So Venezuela has helped Iran whenever it was possible for it to do so, and Iran has always tried to help Venezuela in any way possible as well. So the relationship between Iran and many of these countries is not new, but President Raisi, when he came to power, his policies were a bit different from, or substantially different from his predecessor, and he, I think, focuses more on the global south than the previous administration.
It's really, really interesting to watch Iran kind of making moves, especially with Venezuela and the oil and that border dispute that they have going on right now. And so in January of this year, actually, Iran's vice president met with Niger's prime minister. For our listeners that may not know, Niger went through a coup recently, replaced their government with a military administration, and obviously the West is not happy about that. It resulted in the ousting of the French, and now we're looking at them maybe ousting the Americans. So at this meeting, the vice president expressed Iran's desire to aid Niger's current government in combating sanctions. He said, Iran condemns the cruel sanctions that are imposed by the domination system. Niger has suspended its status of forces agreement signed in 2012 That allowed 1,000 U.S. military personnel and civilian defense staff to operate in the country. Iran also supports Mali and Burkina Faso, two other states that are in the region in the Sahel that have ousted their West-leaning governments for military administrations. Western analysts are very worried that they will soon see Shaheeds in Niger. But what can we expect from Iran in the Sahel region? And are they helping these sort of new military, they call them the young lions of the Sahel, kind of get their colonizers out of their countries?
Yes, we have to keep in mind that the independence that African countries were able to achieve did not end neocolonialism. And the Europeans, the Americans, and the French in particular, they've been exploiting Africa ever since independence. Nothing really has changed, and that's why these countries remain so poor. The countries were not democratic, they were utterly corrupt, and the Western powers were able to install the people in power that they wanted so that they could exploit the continent's resources for themselves. And that hopefully is gradually coming to an end. And in some of these countries where we've seen these military coups, the new leaders want a better deal for their people. And they're looking for alternatives. They want to have good relations with countries across the globe so that there's no monopoly in their countries. And Iran, because of the experiences that it has had over the last 4 decades, and because of the sanctions, largely because of the sanctions, and because Iran has been able to develop its own technology. It's a leading country in many high-tech fields, and of course, as we all know, Iran's military industry is probably now the 3rd, 4th best in the world technology-wise when it comes to drones and missiles and many other types of weapons. So Iran has a lot to offer, although Iran has priorities and unlimited resources because of the sanctions, but also because our region is, meaning West Asia, is very, is facing many problems and crises. But still, Iran does have the capability to help these countries to a degree alongside its friends in Latin America.
I'm going to move back over to South Asia. So in January, Iran and Pakistan kind of exchanged some artillery fire, missile fire, and for those of the world, for people in the world that don't know, they were freaking out thinking Iran was going to war with Pakistan, so that was a lot of fun. But so they both claimed to target these Baloch separatists. Both countries' foreign ministries released statements, and they both said, we respect the territorial integrity of the other, but we have to take measures to safeguard our national security. The whole thing kind of sort of went by without a ton of noise, but that's probably because Westerners have no clue what Balochistan is. So could you maybe shed a little bit of light on that sort of cooperation between Pakistan and Iran? And is it safe to assume that these separatists are being activated to prevent cooperation between Iran and Pakistan and the gas pipeline, and which is ironically named the Peace Pipeline?
Yes, the border situation with Pakistan is a bit complicated. Because there were 2 types of terrorist activities that took place in Iran through the Pakistani border. One was the ISIS attack a few months ago that killed roughly 100 Iranians during the anniversary of General Soleimani, who was murdered by Trump. He led the fight on the ground against ISIS both in Syria and Iraq. So, and of course that ISIS attack, as a result, Iran bombed or struck with their positions with missiles in Syria. But the relationship between ISIS and Western intelligence agencies is another matter. And, right now people are discussing it again because of the attack in Moscow. Because we had a similar outrage in Moscow to what we had in Kerman in Iran. In Iran, almost 100 people were killed. In Moscow, 142 to 3 people at least were murdered. But in addition to that, we have another set of attacks. And that attack was carried out by ISIS. And the other terror attacks were carried out by a separatist group that's based in Pakistan. So both groups use the Pakistani border to carry out terror attacks inside the country. And the problem is that Pakistan is a very weak country. Its economy is broken, it's poor, and the government doesn't have much control over the border region with Iran, especially since its military is focused on India. It puts most of its resources there, and also it has a very long border with Afghanistan, and it has lots of problems with the Taliban. They have differences over the border, and it's complicated. We also have problems with our border with Afghanistan, but in any case, Pakistan has been going through many crises over the last few decades, and of course, the more recent crisis that we've seen during the election period and previous to that, when Imran Khan was arrested and his party dismantled officially. The country, in other words, has many problems, and therefore a no man's land sort of exists on the Pakistani side of the border. So these terrorists have been able to use that absence of government, of state institutions, to create infrastructure for themselves, bases, use it, and they use those as to prepare themselves for attacking inside Iran. So almost simultaneously, we had 2 attacks. One was the ISIS attack, which came through Pakistan, but then we also had the separatist attacks. And these separatists wanted to stage another attack. They were on the verge of carrying out another attack. They had gathered to move towards the Iranian border, and Iranian intelligence discovered that. So the regional military commander had to make a choice. Either he waited for them to attack, because there was no way for them there was no time to inform this government, and then for the government to contact Pakistan, and then the Pakistani government respond. It would have been too late. So he took a decision to strike the terror base where they had gathered with a drone, with at least one drone. I don't know if it was one drone or more. I don't recall. But in any case, a significant number of these people were killed. I think roughly 15 or so. But this wasn't supposed to be publicized. And what happened was that a media outlet in Iran published this news. And if they hadn't done so, the Pakistani government wouldn't have responded in that way. Because it was 2 weeks before the Pakistani elections.
Yes.
And so there's a drone strike inside Pakistani territory. The armed forces is in charge of the country. Doesn't look good for them. So it created a lot of anger in Pakistan, which was understandable. And the Pakistani government or armed forces responded by striking Pakistanis inside Iran, who were basically, they said they were separatists, but my understanding was that they were just economic refugees in the country. But again, that's not an issue That's not something that I want to focus on.
Hi, good morning.
Pakistani say one thing, the Iranians say something else.
Hello?
But in any case, after the Iranian drone strike
Hi,
and
good
the
morning.
Pakistani response, the two sides immediately sat down together, and the Pakistani government promised to
Hi, good morning.
to do something about the border. So the relationship right now is back to normal. It's quite good. Of course, that pipeline that you're alluding to has been
Okay,
blocked
since no one said
because
this
of the
morning, now
United
line, I
States.
will
They've
just
threatened
end this call.
Pakistan
Have
for
a great
many
day, bye.
years. And if that pipeline had been finished, it would have been very beneficial for Pakistan. It would have been very good for Iran too, but for Pakistan in particular, having cheap energy under these circumstances, it would have had huge benefits for the country. But so far, the pipeline hasn't been completed, and the Pakistanis are still trying to figure out if they can finish their side without having the Americans sanction them.
That's highly doubtful. Nobody can do anything without a sanction from the United States. So you kind of got ahead of me, but I do want to talk a little bit about the attack in Iran and the attack in Moscow. Because I've spoken to Scott Ritter, I've spoken to Mark Sloboda, I've spoken to a couple of analysts about the Russia attack. They all say there's no way this is ISIS-K, there's no way this is ISKP, they don't behave in this way, they don't look this way, they don't talk this way, they don't attack this way. They're all saying it's obviously Ukraine. But what do you see when you compare the attacks in Moscow and the attacks that you've seen from ISIS?
Bakit namatay? Okay, continue lang natin, no? Okay. Nagano na. Nag-break.
K in the past, do they look the same, or are things not all as they seem, or what's kind of going on here?
Okay, well, I'll have to bore your audience for a couple of minutes and briefly go through a bit of history. ISIS was a part of Al-Qaeda, or Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda grew in Afghanistan and Pakistan when the United States, before actually the Soviet invasion, Brzezinski and Carter decided to fund radical groups, let's say, or extremist groups, or jihadists, or whatever anyone wants to call them, in Afghanistan to provoke the Soviet Union to invade. This is well documented. Brzezinski also did an interview years later, and he was very proud of this. So after this began and the Soviet Union invaded, Al-Qaeda or Al-Qaeda began to grow in Afghanistan and alongside the Pakistani border with Afghanistan, with U.S. support and Saudi support and British support and so on. So we fast forward. Later on, of course, Al-Qaeda was again used by Western powers. I want to skip 9/11. It was again used after the Arab Spring or the Arab Awakening or the Islamic Awakening, whatever one wants to call it. It was used to overthrow governments. And the West, alongside their regional partners in the Persian Gulf, and Turkey, they began using these extremist groups in Libya to overthrow the government. And of course, Libya today is a destroyed country thanks to NATO and its regional partners. And of course, Syria, but also Yemen. But in the case of Syria, what happened was that Al-Qaeda in Syria, it split. So in Syria and Iraq, Al Qaeda, there was Al Qaeda in Iraq. There was Al Qaeda in Iraq. Ultimately, it became Islam. It became well. Let me put it this way: we had Al Qaeda in Iraq, and then when the dirty war in Syria began, it began to grow in Syria as well, and it was called the Nusra Front. And then Al Qaeda in Iraq decided to make them one. They said, okay, we're going to be one. We're going to have one name. It's going to be the Islamic ISIS, the Islamic State for Iraq and Syria, or the Iraq and Levant, right? ISIL or ISIS. But the branch in Syria refused to accept being part of ISIS. So there was a split between in Al Qaeda, ISIS and the Nusra Front, and then Al Qaeda Central sided with the Nusra Front. They said, okay, you stay separate. And then after that, ISIS became, they broke away with Al Qaeda altogether. They said, okay, we don't accept you anymore. I don't know if I explained this well.
No, you did.
So, and this, by the way, was very fortunate because ISIS and the Nusra Front, which right now is Hayat Tahrir Sham, or HTS, I suppose, they had constant battles, and that weakened them, and it really helped the Syrian government, and also helped the Iraqi government, because these different extremist groups backed by the West and countries in the Persian Gulf, they were at each other's throats at times, and so they couldn't focus completely on Damascus or Baghdad and elsewhere. But in any case, so ISIS was created, and ISIS was funded by these countries in the region, and by Turkey, and by NATO. So, and we have to remember, so ISIS, first it was a part of Al Qaeda, and we have an email that was written on the 12th of February 2012 by Jake Sullivan, who is now the National Security Advisor for Biden. He wrote to Hillary Clinton, who was the Secretary of State at that time, saying that in Syria, Al Qaeda is on our side. Right? So in Syria, Al Qaeda, back then there was no ISIS, they were the same, they were working with Americans. And a lot of their cooperation was done through third parties, like the different so-called secular Syrian, the Free Syrian Army people. It was never a real army. They were basically the people who gave out the weapons. The Americans and the Europeans and others, they would, and the countries in the Persian Gulf and Turkey and Jordan. Jordan, of course, was more passive, but they allowed this to happen. They would give the weapons to the Free Syrian Army people, and then the Free Syrian Army people would give it to ISIS and, to Al Qaeda. Back then, there wasn't ISIS yet. Al Qaeda and the other groups. So the West helped build Al Qaeda. Then, of course, when Al Qaeda split and ISIS grew, they were also supported as well. In fact, there was a young reporter for Press TV back then called Serena Sheen. And she was reporting from the border between Syria and Turkey. And she was saying how ISIS and Turkish intelligence were using UN trucks affiliated to the World Food Program, to send in troops and weapons into Syria. So Turkish intelligence, of course, backed by countries in the Persian, oil-rich countries in the Persian Gulf, and Western countries, they were sending in weapons to support ISIS. And then she was killed. She was threatened by Turkish intelligence. She actually went on TV to say, I've been threatened, and hours later she was killed. And people believe that Turkish intelligence killed her. But in any case, so Then there was also a document that came out, which belonged to the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency. And that document in 2012 said that basically U.S. allies in the region, they wanted to create a Salafist entity between Syria and Iraq to break to separate the two countries from each other and to help isolate Syria. And later on, the head of the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency at that time, he later in an interview, General Michael Flynn, who you've heard of and your audience knows of, did an interview on Al Jazeera of all places and said that the U.S. under Obama took a willful decision to support this policy. So this, who was ultimately this Salafist entity? It was ISIS, because ISIS held the territory between Syria and Iraq. So Al-Qaeda was created by the West and its allies like Saudi Arabia for the Soviet Union. Then it was used later on in Libya and in Syria, Yemen, and elsewhere to undermine enemies of the United States. Then in Syria, it was also, as I said, used against the Syrian government, but it split. So we had ISIS on one side and Al-Qaeda, which was the Nusra Front back then, on the other. So as Jake Sullivan admitted, Al-Qaeda was on their side. So back then, ISIS being a part of Al-Qaeda was on their side. Later on, when they split, according to U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency document, that the ISIS was that entity that regional countries were trying to create. Why am I saying all this? ISIS and Al-Qaeda from the very beginning were deeply infiltrated and influenced by Western powers. Always. ISIS has never, even at its height, was never a centralized organization. It didn't have a command structure like, let's say, the US government, or the Chinese government, or the Iranian government, where you have a central authority. They're tribes and groups, and they have allegiance to ISIS, but it's spread out, and there's a lot of autonomy, and so different tribes and different groups have different loyalties, or they were influenced by different players. And the West was supporting this. They were allowing ISIS to export oil to Turkey. Turkey was importing oil from ISIS. There would be thousands of tankers that would take oil from Syria to Turkey from those areas that were taken by ISIS. And U.S. planes would fly over and do nothing. Only after Iran convinced the Russians to enter the fight in Syria did the Russian Air Force begin bombing these tankers. Thousands of tankers, many thousands of tankers, maybe, I don't know, tens of thousands of tankers, I don't know the numbers, many thousands of these, that would go directly to Turkey or to Erbil and from there to Turkey. So ISIS was exporting oil to a NATO country and to Kurdish Iraq, which was where the Americans had huge influence. So the West was supporting them, countries in the Persian Gulf were supporting them, and tens of thousands of foreign fighters came into Syria through Turkey, a NATO country, and they were facilitated by Western intelligence agencies. Oh, ISIS may exist today, right? So I know that what's the debate that's going on over what happened in Moscow. ISIS may exist today. ISIS may have carried out the attack. But that doesn't mean that since ISIS carried out the attack that the West wasn't involved, or that Ukraine wasn't involved. So these may have actually been people that ISIS gathered, whether in Iran or in Moscow, but someone else was asking ISIS to do this, or funding ISIS to do this. Because remember, ISIS is fragmented. and it's very weak and it's broken. It's not like it was before. It's had historically, as I said earlier, both as Al Qaeda but later as ISIS, heavily influenced by many countries. And all of the attacks that we've seen, almost all of the major attacks have been against countries that have problems with the United States. There have been a couple of instances, for example, in Paris, where there was an attack, but for the most part, and especially in recent years, all of the major attacks have been carried out in Iran, in Russia, in Syria, in places where there are governments that are critical of the United States, or the United States considers them to be adversaries. So ISIS can be involved, but that doesn't mean that if ISIS is involved, that let's say the Ukrainian intelligence is not. And especially, I mean, even the Turkish government recently, they were saying that foreign powers could have been involved in what happened in Russia. Of course, I think the Turkish government has a...
Okay, napailing lang ako mga suki, no? Yung pag-aaral natin ito, geopolitics, napailing lang ako. Nakayuko, okay, sa itong narrative report po ni Professor Said Muhammad Marandi, mga suki, no? Okay. Parang hindi ko matanggap. Okay. Hindi ko matanggap po. Napailing lang ako, napayuko ako, halos tumulo ang mga luha ko. Okay, itong aral po sa geopolitics, no?
Ang programang Station Pinong Balita at Iba ay tumatalakay sa mga isupang kasalukuyan at napapanahon. Mapapolitika, mapapinyon, mapakomentaryo at balita, ang programa ito ay patas sa lahat. Walang kinikilingan, walang kinakampihan, at walang pinapanigan ang programa ito. Ang programa ito ay public service sa kahanginan at trabaho lamang.
Okay, yung kayo mga susunod na talinglayo, no? Okay, patuloy lang pag-aral po ng mga kaalaman po. Okay, natin sa daigdig mga suki, no? Ganon po mga estilo, okay, ng masasabi natin panlilang po. Okay, sa publiko. Okay, lalo na sa global citizen, no? Kaya dapat hindi tayo ignorante rito. Malaman natin ang mga kalakaran po ng mga ginagawa po ng mga superpower, no? Ayan. So, mag-aral pa rin tayo. Courtesy po ni Professor Said Muhammad Marandi, no? Ayan.
Sort of selfish interest here, because they could easily be accused as being a part of this, because ISIS has a very long relationship with Turkey, a long-standing relationship, and they've cooperated together for years during the height of ISIS. So maybe the Turks want to say it wasn't us, and since their relationship with Russia is somewhat problematic nowadays. But in any case, even the Turks are saying that this couldn't have been done by just a number of, without the help of a foreign major intelligence agency.
Well, absolutely not. And I don't know if you heard, but right before the attack, at least one of the attackers was in Istanbul on vacation. And I know that one of them, when they got caught, did mention Idlib. It kind of just seemed too perfect for them to be caught and say, I was trained in northern Syria. We're ISIS, I swear, we're ISIS. But yeah, so Turkey's probably doing what it can to get out in front of it, especially since that tenuous relation between Russia, as we all know about the Green Deal falling apart. So now we'll finally...
And Idlib is a place where all sorts of terror groups are there. And
like
the Americans... Yeah, and the Americans and the Americans want it, and Turkey is preserving it. So, the attacks carried out in Iran, as I said, and elsewhere, everywhere you look, there's a link to Idlib. And tomorrow, these people will be used for Central Asia, they'll be used for Afghanistan, they'll be used wherever the Americans want to use them because they're funded. They sustain. Who funds them in Idlib? They have countries in the Persian Gulf, NATO. They're and of course Israel. They've had a historic relationship with ISIS and Al Qaeda. Both ISIS and Al Qaeda have had bases alongside the Golan Heights for years, and every time the Syrian army would try to take that land back from ISIS or Al Qaeda, as I said, they were side by side, the Israeli regime would bomb Syrian forces. They would use artillery. They would use tanks, and they would also, as I think many know, they would treat their injured in Israeli hospitals. Yeah, so ISIS is, when some people say these Islamic jihadists, I find that to be not accurate. These are American jihadists.
They're my jihad.
Yeah, they're NATO jihadists. Whether it's they've been doing their bidding for over 40 years. Now we could talk about 9/11.
Okay, American jihadists, European jihadists. Okay, sabi po ni Professor Marandi, no? Hindi original na mga jihadists. Okay, hindi puso ng mga tunay na jihadists, mga suki, no? So, American jihadists, European jihadists, kung saan-saan manggaling. Okay, yung mga nangyari po dyan sa gitnang silangan, no? So, matuto kayo. Mga kabataan, okay, ya Allah, bigyan kayo ng mga puso po na maintindihan nyo itong mga kalagayan ng daigdig, no? Huwag basta-basta papasok po sa mga organization na hindi nyo alam po ang background, mga suki, no? Okay, tapos may mga funding na hindi nyo alam kung saan ang galing. Okay, sayang lang ang buhay ng mga pumapasok po dito sa mga organization dito, mga suki, no? Okay. So, paalala, mabuti masakit ang lig ko kaya yung boses ko, hindi ako gaano makaboses. Kaya nga, pinabayaan na lang natin itong nila professor. Marandi sila na lang mag-explain, mga suki, no? Okay. Ayan.
But 9/11 aside, and whatever happened there, whatever happened on 9/11, we know that a decade after 9/11, the Americans were in bed with Al Qaeda. And again, as I said, later on, ISIS, it was Al Qaeda. Later on, it separated. A decade later, in order to undermine Libya and Syria, the Americans were using Al Qaeda. So, what does that say about 9/11, or what does that say about the United States? That's for your viewers to think about. But in any case, these are NATO jihadists.
That's a great way to look at it, because they really don't have ideology. I've read and seen interviews with a lot of these terror groups from the northern Syria, and one that really struck me was the guys from Turkestan, the Uyghurs, who were saying, I don't even know who I'm killing. I'm just here to get trained so I can go back to China. And so it's like just this little terror factory that just creates these separatists to go back to countries that the United States doesn't like, or to complicate resources that the United States doesn't want other countries to use. So yeah, and that's the huge reason why northern Syria we've got such a death grip on it.
Well, actually, ideologically speaking, many are like that. But also the ideology itself was, Salafism and Wahhabism has its own history, but Muhammad Ibn Abdul Wahhab was influential in a small part of Saudi Arabia, in Najd. And back then Saudi Arabia that land was very impoverished. So later on, when the Americans wanted to create these groups, they used that ideology. It was the Saudis that promoted Wahhabism and Salafism alongside the Americans. And in fact, in Afghanistan, during the Dirty War in the 1980s. Back then, the Saudis didn't have the sort of capabilities that it has now, so the Americans actually published their Takfiri literature. I think it was the University of Nebraska that published their text. I think your viewers should look this up. I think it's the University of Nebraska that first began to publish these books. They would be sent to Pakistan, so for school students or young people and so on to read, and to make them takfiri and hostile towards the Russians or the Soviets. And so Wahhabism was an obscure ideology which became very influential thanks to this alliance between NATO and Saudi Arabia and other countries in the Persian Gulf. And they spread this ideology across the board in different parts of the world. So it wasn't widespread, but it became very influential. And I don't want to cause anyone trouble, but even in, Western governments allowed them to be very influential in their own countries.
Absolutely. And another book is The Ghost Wars that is really interesting. It talks about how America came in and set up those schools and then helped publish the materials from Saudi. So exactly what you're talking about. Now we'll finally switch to the Levant, which I'm sure everybody is wanting us to talk about what's actually going on. So I don't know if you've noticed, I exist online probably too much. But in the social media sphere, we're seeing a concerted effort to really delegitimize Iran and the entire axis of resistance for kind of these hokey sort of Jordan did an airdrop of aid and like just silly things. So, but every time anybody from Hamas speaks, they thank Iran, they thank Hezbollah. But the rhetoric in the Arab diaspora that condemns Iran and suggests they aren't helping enough, or it's kind of funny, I can't believe I'm saying this, or are even hurting Gazans to further their own interests in Iran. We obviously disagree, but to those who might not, could you give us some expansion on what ways Iran really supports the resistance lately?
Well, first I have to point out that a lot of this is understandable because for decades the anti-Iranian propaganda, both in the Arab media, which is almost universally state-owned, directly or indirectly, has been very extensive. So there have been both racial elements to it, but also sectarian elements to it. A lot of strange beliefs and ideas have been attributed, for example, to Shias through this media to their Sunni audience. So they try to create these divisions and hatred and animosity through fake news, through dishonest analysis and spreading disinformation. And the same is true in the Western media. What I think is, because I don't want to go into detail, I think that the latest episode, or let's say the last few months of Gaza, has shown how dishonest the corporate media, the mainstream Western media, state media is in the West. I think that's become common knowledge, that Western media is completely dishonest. They are, a genocide is taking place in front of a global audience, and they are either whitewashing the Israeli actions, or they're supporting Israel, or they're looking away. And I think we all know that now. So all I can say is that taking that into account, then I think it's best to rethink everything that people have heard about Iran. Whatever people have heard about Iran over the last 4 decades, you have to look at it again. You have to take what's happened over the last few months and how the Western media has behaved in disinformation, and then we think Iran. So Iran is not what people think it is. It is a very normal country. It is a country that has been through great difficulty after the revolution, the Americans have
Since
imposed
no one's speaking with me
a
in this
war.
call, once again, this is
Americans
Jeremiah Brothers and supporting this group.
Europeans and
What supported
these
this group calling on
oil-rich
behalf of
dictatorships
Cash?
in
Have
the
a
Persian
nice
Gulf, they
day.
supported Saddam Hussein. They gave him chemical weapons. They gave him the military intelligence to use those chemical weapons and the political cover to get away with using chemical weapons. I survived 2 chemical attacks myself. Many died. Both Iraqis, because he used it against his own people, and Iranians. Many thousands died. And many died a slow death. It took years for them to die. And some are still dying, because it's for some it just gets worse and worse. But in any case, so these crimes against the Iranian people also kept the country back. And then after the war, we had the sanctions. And the sanctions against Iran over the last few decades have all been about Palestine. Everything that you hear about Iran, all of the sanctions, whether it's about human rights or the nuclear program or terrorism, the real reason behind all of this is Palestine. And Iran's policy towards Palestine, and Iran's support for Palestine. And have no doubt, if Iran abandoned its support for the Palestinian people, the sanctions would go away. I mean, imagine right now what the Americans would be willing to offer to Iran for Iran to just stop supporting the Palestinian people. Just imagine what they would be willing to do at this moment. So Iran has made significant sacrifices over the decades for the Palestinian people, and they've never betrayed them, they never backstabbed them, even during moments when some of the Palestinian factions, or at least elements within some of the Palestinian factions, were fooled into thinking that some of the groups in Syria were really independent and fighting for the Syrian people. Iran continued to support them in the Palestinian cause, even though the Iranians were against the position of those individuals, or some individuals and some groups towards Syria. These people made a big mistake. Now I think it's become clear what happened in Syria. I think anyone who's fair-minded would know. Now some may say, well, the Syrian government some may hate the Syrian government. But regardless of what they think about the Syrian government, I've been to Syria many times, from 2000, I think, late 2012, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. I would go every year for 3-4 times a year. I go to universities. Students, some of them love President Assad, some of them liked him, some of them were indifferent, some of them, it was clear that they didn't like him. But they didn't want the terrorist groups. They didn't want the extremists. They didn't want those groups at the West and
Okay, may tawag pala. Sandali lang. Patapusin natin ang tawag.
Ang programang station ng balita at ay tumatalakay sa mga isupang kasalukuyan at napapanahon. Mapapolitika, mapapinyon, mapakomentaryo at balita. Ang programa ito'y patas sa lahat. Walang kinikilingan, walang pinakampihan at walang pinapamilan ang programa ito. Ang programa ito ay public service sa kahanginan at trabaho lamang.
have support against these groups, they wouldn't have been able to survive. Because, I mean, how much could Iran... I mean, these Russians came in 2015. How much could Iran help Syria? If the whole country was against the government, it would have fallen, especially since almost all the surrounding governments were supporting the extremist groups. So, in any case, the Iranians continued to support the Palestinian resistance against the Israelis during the last couple of decades, and even though Iran doesn't decide on behalf of the Palestinian group, so on October the 7th, Iran was not involved in the decision-making process to carry out the attack, which in my opinion was a completely legitimate attack. I mean, from the very first, some of our mutual friends contacted me and we did programs together. They were saying, they were cautious, and I was saying, no, it was completely legitimate. Of course, now they're more. I think any fair-minded person understands that it was a legitimate attack, and many of the claims made by the Israelis turned out to be lies. But in any case, people in the death camp or the concentration camp called Gaza, who were expelled from their lands, they hit back after decades of subjugation and after being ethnically cleansed. If it was the French resistance, the West would call them heroic, but since they're Palestinians, they are, they're terrorists. But in any case, the point is that Iran obviously was deeply involved in the defense capabilities of the resistance, without a doubt. Without Iran's support, there would be no resistance in Gaza, or in Yemen, or in Lebanon, or elsewhere. And so their defense capabilities have everything to do with the heroic defenders of Gaza, but also due to the fact that the Iranians have been helping them create their infrastructure and their defense capabilities. So the Iranians have made many sacrifices, but again, because of the anti-Iranian propaganda that we've been seeing for decades, many people, it's very difficult for them to think beyond the narratives that have been so powerful. And as I said, many of those narratives were built upon race and sectarianism and all sorts of disinformation. But gradually things are changing, because I remember when Yemen was being attacked, bombed day and night, similar to Gaza, and they were also being starved, similar to Gaza. There was very little sympathy for them. And Ansarullah, or what the West likes to call the Houthis, Ansarullah, they were on their own. And a lot of people in our region and beyond did not care for them. But now, many of these people see them as the heroes of the region or the Arab world. So I think things are changing.
I think so. I think you're right. So this also kind of goes along with those breaking in the Palestinian resistance movement. The Prime Minister of Palestine presented his cabinet, I think it was 2 days ago. So this is the new government under Prime Minister Mustafa. It's opposed by Hamas and Islamic Jihad. I don't know about the PFLP or the DFLP. I haven't seen anything. But we've also heard from Palestinians who have expressed concern over this new government, worried that they'll take the agency away from Hamas and take over the Gaza Strip, at least administratively, if not in a demilitarized fashion. What do you think of this new cabinet, and how will the relations with Iran change?
From the very beginning, when the war in Gaza entered this new phase, because the war has been going on for decades. This is nothing began on October the 7th. October the 7th was just a new chapter in this conflict, of where the Israelis, again, your audience knows this, but just a reminder, the Israelis ethnically cleansed these people, put them in this concentration camp, surrounded it, and periodically they'd carry out massacres. And the West never cared. And they don't care now, as we see. And I mean regimes, Western regimes. So, from the beginning, a lot of our friends, many of them, as I said, those who were influenced by anti-Iranian narratives would contact me and say, Gaza will fall. My understanding from the very beginning, from people who have knowledge, was that Gaza wasn't going to fall. And I think the information that I was fed, well, not fed, but the information that was given to me turned out to be very accurate. And Gaza is not going to fall. And therefore, the United States and the Israeli regime and their allies are not going to get their way in Gaza. And the resistance will continue. They are prepared for a very long war. They are not running out of ammunition. They are building new tunnels as we speak. They are increasing their stockpiles as we speak. And they have new recruits, or getting new recruits as we speak. Their defense capabilities are preserved, and the Israeli regime is not going to be able to overcome them. They're not going to be vanquished. And ultimately, I think that it's the Americans and Israelis, that their over-the-top demands are going to continue to be met with scorn, and they're going to have to be more realistic. The world has changed, and Gaza is not alone. The resistance front in Lebanon will continue to make sacrifices to support Gaza. In Yemen, they will continue to make sacrifices, and if the Americans push too hard, they now know that their foothold in Iraq and Syria will be lost if they get directly involved. So, and Iran supports the resistance. Iran doesn't hide this. Iran will continue to support the Palestinian people. We have to remember that when the revolution in Iran took place, there are two key foreign policy issues that were close to the heart of the revolutionaries. Before the revolution, during the revolution, and after. One was South Africa and the struggle against apartheid, and the second was Palestine. When the revolution happened, Iran broke off ties with the Israeli regime and with apartheid South Africa. And Iran began to fund the resistance organizations in Palestine and in South Africa. So the ANC military wing was supported and funded by Iran, whereas the West considered the ANC to be a terrorist organization. In fact, the ANC was a terrorist organization according to U.S. law, and Nelson Mandela was a terrorist according to U.S. law. And only after his presidency was over, in other words, he was president of South Africa, and he was still, and he and the ANC were still terrorists according to U.S. law. I think it was in 2012, if I'm not mistaken. Again, your viewers can look this up. In 2012, did they finally remove the ANC and Nelson Mandela from their terror list? So Iran was supporting the terrorists in South Africa, being the liberation organizations, and it's doing the same in Palestine. The same liberation organizations that were that back then were terrorists in South Africa, Western countries have been pretending to be friends with for decades now. And Iran will continue to support, even though Iran is alone, even though Turkey, Mr. Erdogan has, betrayed the cause. He does business with Israel. He's unwilling to do anything for the Palestinian people in Gaza, or Jordan, or the Emirates, or others, even though they refuse to pay a price. But Iran is willing to pay a price, and it has been paying a heavy price for decades now. And so are other movements and governments in the region, like the Yemeni government, and movements such as Hezbollah and its allies in Lebanon, because Hezbollah is not alone. Different parties in Lebanon support the resistance from all religious and different religions and sects. And fortunately, the resistance is growing today. I would argue that the resistance in Europe and North America is enormous. Many young Jews today are at the forefront of the resistance against apartheid and ethno-supremacism in Palestine, just as many young people in Europe and North America during the height of apartheid in South Africa were at the forefront of resistance against the supremacist regime in South Africa too.
Well, I mean, Erdogan did do something wonderful for the whole world this year. He announced that he won't be running for office again. So, Erdogan, thank you for not running for office again and retiring from politics. Earlier this week, we had another ceasefire vote, and this one finally went through only because the United States is mad at Bibi. The United States immediately after called it non-binding. So Algeria, Malta, Mozambique, and Sierra Leone, they submitted objections saying that it is binding. Regardless, Israel has continued to bomb and it has no intention of abiding by it. They blamed this ceasefire for causing Hamas to walk away from negotiations on their ceasefire. Do you think it's becoming clearer that Israel will not be stopped by legal or diplomatic means? And do you think that other countries will be more open to taking some sort of physical or tangible action?
Well, first of all, I don't believe there's any major division between Israel and the United States. And
no, they were just a little bit mad at Bibi about other stuff. So
yeah, I mean, what I meant to say was that the United States was under enormous pressure, both because of what I call the resistance at home, and many young people now turning against the Israeli regime and seeing it for what it is, an illegitimate ethno-supremacist regime. But also internationally, the United States has become deeply isolated. The whole of the West the collective West has become deeply isolated, but the United States is also deeply isolated. So the United States had to take that position under duress. And as you rightly pointed out, they said it's non-binding, but of course, by saying that, they undermined the UN Security Council, because now anyone can say that any resolution is non-binding. But in any case, I think it was still important. You're right, I agree, I believe, that it's not going to have an impact on the behavior of the Israeli regime. This is a brutal genocidal regime that will continue with these crimes against humanity, and the United States will fund it. They will continue to send weapons, as we see. The British will send weapons. Europe will continue to refrain from sanctioning them, and they will give them aid, and they'll do trade with them and try to help them as much as possible without being seen, because the Europeans sort of like to, they don't want to be seen as like the Americans supporting genocide, but they're all in it together. The Australian government, or the regime in Australia, all of them are in this together. They're collectively carrying out this Holocaust. But this is still important, because it shows that the pressure is building. Just as the International Court of Justice, we knew that nothing was going to happen, but it was still an important event, because it strengthened the position of the people of Palestine. It isolated the United States. It isolated Britain and France and Canada and Germany, and it showed them as lacking any morality. So all of these events, whether in the UN Security Council or in the General Assembly or the ICJ or elsewhere, all of these have an impact. It puts more pressure on the Israeli regime and its allies. But at the end of the day, it is going to be the resistance on the ground that defeats the Israeli regime. It is going to be Hamas, Islamic Jihad, their other allies, their allies in Gaza and in the West Bank. It's going to be Yemen, it's going to be Hezbollah, it's going to be the resistance in Iraq and Syria, and of course Iran, which is going to be supporting all of them. They will continue to play their role until the Israeli regime recognizes that it will have to stop the genocide for the sake of its own survival. But of course, I should add that the most important heroes are the people of Gaza, the women, the children, the men who remain steadfast despite the horrific suffering that they've been enduring, the starvation that the regime and the Western allies have been imposing on them by cutting UN aid, and the military support that the West has been giving to them, the political cover that the Western media and Western governments have been giving to them. Despite all that, these people and the suffering that has resulted because of all this, despite all this, these people have remained steadfast. And I think without them, Hamas, Hezbollah, Ansar Allah, Islamic Jihad, Iran, and all the other resistance groups, the Hashid in Iraq and Syria, they couldn't have put the Israeli regime in such a horrific military and political situation. Without the people of Gaza, this would have been impossible.
Last question. The invasion of Rafah, it's kind of been looming over our heads. We have about 1.5 million, maybe 1.7 million refugees there in a makeshift fly-by-night camp. Do you think that the invasion of Rafah is going to occur? If it occurs, what kind of response should we expect from the Arab countries or the axis of resistance? Is this a red line for anybody, or do you think that we're just using this as an empty threat and it won't happen?
Well, the Israeli regime has two options. One is Lebanon and one is Rafah. Or both. If Israel attacks Lebanon, they will be devastated. Hezbollah does not want to expand the war because Hezbollah wants to preserve unity in Lebanon. Right? So Hezbollah is playing a very complicated role. On the one hand, they're striking out at Israel to prevent the Israeli regime from using all of its forces in Gaza. It's forced to keep half of its forces in the north. But on the other hand, it doesn't want to expand the war so that people in Lebanon don't turn against the resistance. But if the Israeli regime expands the war in Lebanon, then Hezbollah has an excuse to hit very hard. They will destroy Israeli infrastructure. They will destroy its gas installations. They will bring down the Israeli economy. The Israelis can only kill ordinary people and bomb homes. Lebanon doesn't have much of an infrastructure. Israel has a lot that can be destroyed. They have a lot to lose. And Hezbollah will do it. And they have the means and the capability. So if they attack Lebanon, they will lose. It will be far worse than anything that they have ever experienced before. Rafah is another option. The Israeli regime has already lost in Gaza. It is looking for a path to victory. And so, because they've been defeated. The greatest defeat, of course, is the fact that they've been exposed to the world as genocidal and criminal and morally illegitimate. That is the greatest defeat. That they brought upon themselves by massacring so many people. But the military defeat, of course, has also been key. They've lost the war in Gaza. But so they are looking for a path to victory. It either goes through Lebanon or through Rafah. But it's only going to make the defeat worse if they attack Lebanon. It's going to make it much worse. If they attack Lebanon. But if they attack Rafah, what happens? Rafah is much... The Israelis, they've been attacking the north of Gaza, central Gaza. For months now, we've been hearing about the attacks and so on. And from the beginning, we were told that they're taking Gaza, they've split it in two, or they split it in three, but as we speak, the regime has not been able to control Gaza City in the north. And even when they carried out this new atrocity in the Al-Shifa hospital, we saw that the resistance has been attacking them from all sides. So they failed. In the south, the Israeli regime would have to go, in the north something like between 12 and 14, again your viewers can look it up, 12 to 14 kilometers wide. So the Israelis would have a much tougher job moving into Rafah. And on the other hand, the world cannot tolerate these atrocities. Some people say the Israelis can continue forever and nothing will happen. I don't agree with that. Already, the regime has lost its legitimacy in the eyes of the global community. And anger is building up. Remember, in a decade and a half ago, people thought that this region was quiet. North Africa and West Asia was quiet and stable, and the despots were all, very well entrenched. And then some young man in Tunisia, he killed himself because of because how he was being oppressed and he was being abused. And it led to the overthrow of multiple governments. So when people in Saudi Arabia, in Jordan, in Egypt, and elsewhere, when they have to sit and watch all this happen, the anger builds up. So the more atrocities committed by the Israeli regime, the more dangerous it becomes for the regime itself. And the more unstable become these client regimes of the United States, and the more isolated the West and the United States in particular becomes. So in my opinion, in my personal opinion, even though we all want an immediate ceasefire, but the regime that needs a ceasefire more than anyone else is the Israeli regime. Every day that this war continues, it is worse for the Israeli regime. True, they're massacring women and children. True, every morning we wake up to the news of more massacres. That's correct. And it's very painful for all of us. But of course, all liberation movements gave major sacrifices. In Algeria, over 1 million people were killed by the French until they achieved independence. If you want independence, if you want sovereignty, if you want dignity, you have to pay a price, because the West, these regimes, not the people, we see, as I said, people coming to the defense of the Palestinian people across the Western world. But these regimes, they're utterly brutal. They have no morality. They lack any decency. They're utterly evil. They've exposed themselves in Gaza. This is an unprecedented genocide in human history. Why? Because it's taking place in front of our eyes. And as it's happening, they are continuing to support this genocide, this Holocaust. So they've destroyed themselves. I won't say they've diminished themselves. They've destroyed themselves. The Israeli regime needs a ceasefire. It needs it today, but it's too foolish and too extremist, and its people are too sick to recognize what they're doing to themselves. But I'm very optimistic about the future, and I hope that there's a ceasefire. But whether the Israelis expand in Rafah, whether it's a limited attack or a major attack, or whether they expand in Lebanon, it's just a path to greater defeat. And ultimately, I do not believe that the Israeli regime, the Zionist project, will last much longer. I don't know if it will end in 2 years or 10 years, but this regime, after what it's done to the people of Palestine, it has no place in West Asia. And the only solution for Palestine is for a single state where everyone lives as equal human beings, whether Jewish, Muslim, or Christian, where ethno-supremacism is cast aside completely. And I'm not saying South Africa is some utopia. South Africa has huge problems, but at least it is no longer an ethno-supremacist state. So that is what we look for.
I can't think of a better note to end on than a hopeful outlook for the end of Israel and the beginning of a one state under the flag of Palestine, hopefully in our lifetime. Thank you so much, Professor. Any closing thoughts, and let our listeners know where they can find you, what you're working on, where they can see more of you.
Well, I only have a Twitter account. I've been removed from Facebook and Instagram a long time ago, and I haven't bothered to return. So that's it basically. I have some interviews like the one with yourself on that they may be able to find on YouTube or Rumble or elsewhere.
Well, then we'll have to make more content.
But thank you very much for having me, and I hope all of your viewers they continue to remain very active in their support for the Palestinian people. This is not going to end tomorrow, and we should always keep the Palestinian people as a top priority. And even though we all have things to do, we have to make time for them every day to increase the pressure against those forces that are supporting the genocide in Gaza.
Well, thank you, and thank all of our listeners for coming. I hope you enjoyed this interview. Please visit the website. We are still doing collections for Yemen. We did an aid drop yesterday, I believe, in Hodeida. So please visit the website for options to contribute or work together and collaborate. And once again, thank you to Professor Morandi. It's been another episode of the DD Geopolitics live stream.
Okay, yon po ang pangaral po ni Professor Said Muhammad Marandi, no? Okay, at least nalalaman po natin ng mga ginagawa dyan po sa kanila sa mga Middle East, sa Asian region, okay, sa Latin America, sa South Africa, at saka itong Eastern Europe. Ayan. So, klaro po mga suki, no? Hindi na ko kailangan mag-explain yun. Pag at least narinig nyo. Ayan. Wala na po ang jihadist tunay ni Propeta Muhammad, peace be upon him, no? Okay, ilan taon yung 12 years ba yun na ginugol niya pag jihad. Yon po ang tunay na jihad, no? Sa ngayon, kung papasok ka sa jihad, kundi jihad ng Amerika, jihad ng NATO, okay, kung anong mga jihad, mga suki ang napasukan mo. Yan. So, in-explain na po ni Professor Said Muhammad Marandi, no? Kung saan nanggaling mga ISIS yan, kung saan nanggaling ang mga Al-Qaeda niyan, Al-Nusra, ISIS, o at least naintindihan yung mga suki, no? Ayan. Maintindihan natin sa pamamagitan po pag-aaral itong tinuturo po ng professor, okay, o professor po ni Said Muhammad Marandin. Ang gusto ko lang sa kanila, no, okay, yung mga bansa nila katulad ng Iran, inalagaan po yung mga katulad nila Marandin, no, okay, inalagaan, binuhay ng sinusuportahan, okay, dahil sa katalinuhan nila, okay, sinusuportahan po yung mga akademya, okay, ng mga bansang sa Middle East, mga suki, no. So bihira ka makatakbo katulad ng utak nila Professor Said Muhammad Marandin, no. Ayan, alam niyang kasaysayan po ng geopolitik po sa mundo, mga suki, no. Ayan. Dito, mga magagaling sa atin, wala. Okay. Nasa outside di Colombo, mga suki, no, yung mga okay, magagaling dito sa atin, outside sila Colombo. Hindi kasali po sa institution, mga suki, no. Bihira. Ayan. So, yan po pagkaibahan ng bansa natin at saka bansang katulad ng Iran at saka mga ibang bansa, mga suki. Pag magaling ka, kinuha and then nilalagaan ng mabuti, na. Ayan. So, wala na. Okay, nalalayan ko ang boses ko, no? Baka mawala sa ere na, kaya nga hindi ako pinilit ko balita. Ayan. Sige.
Ang programang station ng balita at iba ay tumatalakay sa mga isupang kasalukuyan at napapanahon. Mapapolitika, mapapinyon, mapakomentaryo at balita, ang programa ito'y patas sa lahat. Walang kinikilingan, walang kinakampihan, at walang pinapanigan ang programa ito. Ang programa ito ay public service sa kahanginan at trabaho lamang.
So, hindi na tayo makakuha po ng balita dito sa lokal, okay lang yon. Mahalaga po leksyon ni Professor Said Muhammad Marandi. At least alam natin po mga kalokohan po dyan sa Middle East, mga suki, na. Okay, alam natin kung saan nanggaling ang pondo, kung sinong magsuporta. Okay, jihad ng Amerika at saka jihad po ng NATO. Ayan. So, hindi po jihad ng Islam. Okay. Yung tunay, yung jihad ng Islam. Okay. Sige po, mga kababayan, paalam tayo dito sa Consolidated News natin. Okay. Sa programa pa rin na Halo-Halo Special, Opinion, Balita at iba pa. Ayan. Okay, kasama po sa Biso Publiko Tinig ng Mamamayan at sa kaugnayan sa mamamayan. Hanggang dito muna. Wala tayong masamang tinapay. Masama lang ang boses ko, no? Okay, kaya hindi mo ka-news. Ayan. Ayan po, mga suki, mga kabayan. Paalam tayo. Wala tayong masamang tinapay sa kahit kanino. Okay, information dissemination lang po at saka itong education. Ayan. Okay, para hindi tayo tanga-tanga. Ayan po. Ay, hindi na tayo naman bobo. Okay, at least alam natin po ang itong mga nakapaligid sa atin sa daigdig, mga magumpukan ng mga superpower. Ayan, at least educated tayo ni Professor Said Muhammad Marandi, na. Ayan. Okay, babalik ako mamayang sa prime time. Okay, sa balita. Kahit mga ganito lang habang hindi pa nakakabawi ang boses natin, na. Ayan.
Ang programa ng Station Pinyong Balita at iba pa ay tumatalakay sa mga isyu pang kasalukuyan at napapanahon. Mapapolitika, mapapinyon, mapakomentaryo at balita, ang programa ito ay patas sa lahat. Walang kinikilingan, walang kinakampihan, at walang pinapanigan ang programa ito. Ang programa ito ay public service sa kahanginan at trabaho lamang.
Tapos diba, about charge ang ano.
Meron ba dito charges yata?
Hindi ba mahina? Kailangan
Ano?
tubig.
Dahil na lang doon ko sana pag-ayos ko.
Ay, alam ko nang bilihan doon sa buso. Tingin.